Ancient alien gods. Now, this is a topic that I've always been specifically interested in. Being raised as a Christian, I always heard these tales of, angels coming down from heaven. And I'd see people in church with their hands up, feeling this energy of connecting with Christ or their higher power. So I find it fascinating that around the world there are these stories of a time when man lived amongst their living gods, interacted with their living gods. So in today's lesson, we're going to kind of review some of the world culture's view of these interactions and see if there aren't similarities that we want to take note of. As I mentioned, being raised as a Christian, kind of want to start in some of the things that I was familiar with. And really what I always found fascinating about the biblical information, obviously with the overtone of the ancient astronaut theory, is looking at the fact that there's always a presence of them coming down from the skies. Now, most of the Renaissance artwork that we have coming out of the last, several hundred years, especially around this Renaissance era, all of the biblical information always depicts the beings coming down from heaven. And many references in the Bible, too, depict either beings ascending into heaven or descending into heaven with these types of winged angelic beings, usually with halos of light around them and depicted with wings, as if they have the power of flight. So whether it be, Elijah being taken up by a whirlwind, or Ezekiel seeing what appear to be wheels within wheels, or a chariot of fire in the sky, I don't think ancient man had access or could fully understand and relate to technology that we do today to describe aerial phenomenon and such. Whether we would say it's an airplane, a helicopter, or possibly a nuclear propelled craft like a TR-3B, or even an anti-gravitic device, which I'm sure is in production. So a lot of these things, again, have a biblical or spiritual overtone, but we have to wonder if this isn't just misrepresented technology. All of these scenes that come out of this Renaissance artwork are very visual and kind of trying to portray this biblical, technological connection between heaven and earth. You can see that these two gentlemen appear to be manipulating what appears to be some type of a rod. And as you can see, there's a clear path of them whirling what appears to be into the sky. So a lot of this artwork, I think, has an overtone that is very familiar with the normal Christian views of these bright angelic beings, usually also depicted with wings. Well, it's very interesting to note that a lot of these depictions in the Christian, Judeo-Christian Bible of beings with wings aren't just depicted for Christianity as these higher spiritual beings. In fact, most cultures around the world, even thousands of years predating the Hebrew or Christian Bible, have very similar references and stories to these angelic beings and depict them in the same way. Now, this can't be by coincidence that different cultures around the world, some of them without even having contact to the outside world, have similar stories, similar depictions. And obviously where I was most fascinated in my being raised as a Christian was looking at the fact that these ancient Sumerian texts and ancient depictions of their gods, the Anunnaki, again, resonate exactly with what we hear in the Hebrew and Christian Bible. More specifically, it has more detail. Just like in the Hebrew version, there were many gods. In the Christian version, there's only one God. In our image and after our likeness, there were once giants upon the earth. So as we go back from the Christian Hebrew to the Sumerian versions, not only do the depictions become more interesting, but we see similar references to this understanding of the power of flight. So let's go ahead and look at this as we realize that this is a depiction that we've seen over and over with reference to biblical information, how we're bequeathed information from higher life forms. They're usually depicted as coming down from the heavens. This is a consistent theme with the ability for them to be above the populace, always above, the gods are always above in the sky. Now that's not to say that there aren't gods in the ground as well, or ancient cultures didn't think that way. There are many different cultures that believed there were underground gods. Indian gods looked at a serpent race called the Nagas that believed lived in underground areas. And there were actually Mayan and Aztec rituals to appease what they believed to be subterranean gods. Again, these serpent gods. We're going to come back to that topic in a minute. It's a very interesting point. But we definitely see a common theme with depictions of these biblical references, Jesus and various other angelic references. They're always coming down from the sky. Now, what we also see in connection with these, heavenly scenes, or again, things depicted in the sky, is usually a reference to some type of technological use of a device. We've seen this over and over in various biblical scenes where, again, ancient man didn't understand what they were seeing and tried their best to represent and depict what they were seeing. Now, to me, this looks like two spiritual beings, obviously clothed in robes and in the clouds. So this represents them being in the sky, but they're manipulating some circular device. You can see that they're holding it as if these are two antennae, kind of like tuning into God, if you will. Now, how would they have been able to represent what if they saw a circular flying craft and either beams of light or men in the craft manipulating levers and gears, or what appeared to be doing some type of tuning with an antenna? They wouldn't understand it. They wouldn't be able to explain it. All they could do is give visual references. So when we analyze a lot of this artwork, we have to understand that back then they didn't understand technology, but we do. And we can look at a lot of these references of what appear to be the power of flight actually being depicted as technological sources of information. Even how we would characterize our own flight characteristics, like a spaceship, and things that we would use now as the top of the rocket departs the capsule and then actually travels in space or returns. A lot of these things have very similar references to our own uses for the power of flight. Now, this is a very infamous scene of the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's shown in this fresco in this large monastery in what was then Yugoslavia. And you can see, again, these references to power of flight. And you can see that the gentleman in here is manipulating. Again, he has his hands positioned. He's doing something. They don't understand, but they clearly saw him manipulating something in the craft. So they did their best to describe it. And again, you can see over in this corner, this one too has similar references. Now, I believe I have some more enlarged shots of this with higher resolution, so we'll just move on to those. But obviously, the crucifixion of Jesus, we have these very interesting scenes where even the beings with the angels, again, the winged beings, are looking and noticing the craft and are holding their hands up as if they're scared of these craft in the sky. And these can't be, again, coincidence. All they can do is depict what they were seeing. This looks like some type of a man flying in a comet. But what we can deduce with science is that anything that's flying within our atmosphere that's a high energy source is going to create a gaseous environment. It's going to create phosphorescence in our atmosphere. Anything that interacts with our gaseous atmosphere is going to instantly create phosphorescence. That's why most of the high energy sources that we see filmed are just a ball of light, because anything that's just a high energy source is going to be depicted that way. And that's exactly what a lot of these depictions show us, what appear to be their observation of exactly what we see today with our own filming equipment. So these are actually pretty accurate representations of what apparently are UFOs, but in ancient times, and being depicted as piloted by other human-like beings. Now, of course, they would think that they were gods. How else could they perceive this without understanding technology? Now, as I referenced earlier, some of the Christian angelic references to these winged beings, we have to give note to the fact that there is many other depictions, even thousands of years before the Christian angel, even 10,000 years when we go back to the Hindu representations of Indian gods and their flying in vimanas and have other similarities to these winged craft or the winged disc that you can see here. Many of the ancient cultures, specifically the oldest one we have on record, Sumer, depict the Anunnaki, which we're of course going to extensively cover in some of these courses. But some of the symbology that we see is very interesting as a reference to the power of flight, whether it be with wings or with this circular disc with wings, the winged disc. Now again, if they see a disc flying in the sky, how else can they explain that this circular object was in the sky or was moving in the sky? They give it the reference of having wings. So to me, this is very clear information. A being with the power of flight in a winged disc or in a craft of some sort with even landing gear depicted. This makes sense when you understand that they didn't understand technological references. They could only depict it with what they understood at the time. But the clear representation and similarities of Christian angels or the Sumerian Anunnaki, we have to understand it's kind of like a chicken before the egg. No, the Sumerian depictions of the Anunnaki are the oldest references that we currently have of these winged beings. And we can see that through other Semitic cultures, the term Anunnaki, through Akkadian texts and various other places in Iran and Iraq, we see these wall reliefs and inscriptions about these beings. Now, this winged disc is also carried over into obviously the Egyptian culture, the sun god Ra and Isis, again, carrying this symbolic reference to the winged disc. This is actually a clay tablet from Sumerian times that they turned into stone. They would use a cylinder seal and reverse carve these intricate pictures, and then when they roll it over wet clay, it would leave this positive imprint. And they would then just stick this piece of clay into a stove, a kiln, and literally hardening it into stone, keying that phrase writing in stone, even though they also did pictograms, which you can see, even though it's thousands of years old, very detailed. And we see the similar depictions where they're holding this staff with a point on the end that looks like a spear. Is this some type of a powerful rod of energy or something that they were utilizing? And the winged disc is always coming down on this tree, this reference to what possibly is the tree of life. Now, again, this is an Assyrian wall relief. What we also see is some of these references to a combination of hybrid beings, whether it be a sphinx, a minotaur, etc. Various hybridization projects that, if we understand the information from the ancient Sumerian texts, they very clearly explain that they did genetic intervention. The Neanderthal man that was naturally here, they put their genetic marker on them and created us in their image and after their likeness. Now again, these are stories that we'll get into in further detail, but these references to hybridization of beings make a lot more sense if we realize that our own inception was a genetic intervention and a cross hybridization between their genes and ours. Again, just like what the Bible says, they created us in their image and after their likeness. So one of the more exciting aspects, obviously, about this information is that all throughout these various scenes with gods or angels, we see clear depictions of the power of flight and very accurate intrinsic details that are synonymous with the power of craft today, and not so much a bird or an insect, which would be the natural characteristics that you might see of just giving them wings. As we discussed earlier, any type of large energy source flying through our gaseous atmosphere, nitrogen, oxygen, these are going to interact with a large power source by producing photons, beams of light. Anyone filming a high energy source craft today most likely gets just a ball of light, beams of light, a bright object in the sky. Well, this is nothing new. You can see from a fresco done by Saint Giovanni of the Madonna, and out of reference here, she's holding baby Jesus. What's interesting, though, is that you can see that there's a gentleman standing here and a dog next to him, and they're both clearly looking up in observation of this glowing craft. Now, this craft has some very interesting characteristics. It looks like it has to be what are portals around the side. And it has very clear characteristics of what we see today in modern UFO reports. A disc-shaped curved surface on the top and a dark underside. And again, emanating rays of energy. It's some type of large energy source that's flying in the sky, enough to catch their attention. So this should really raise some questions, again, as to why would they be depicting something that doesn't look like a comet, doesn't look like an asteroid, doesn't look like a cloud. It looks like a UFO, 100%. And this is something that we see over and over, as these depictions of flight very accurately representing either the ability to fly or in great detail saying they were witnessing beings that had the power of flight. Now, this is a Sumerian statue of the god Ishtar, and whether or not this disc is just symbolic as, again, she was flying in a disc with the wings and the disc. This is a very interesting story that talks about how the god Ishtar, she was a very attractive god and liked to roam the skies of Earth in her skycraft. And she would choose certain men to come into her sky abode. And of course they accepted. She's a beautiful goddess. But then they would never return. So there is a story of King Gilgamesh, another ancient Sumerian king, who was 2/3 Anunnaki. And he was invited by Ishtar to come into her sky abode. And he said, no, no, no. Thank you anyways, but I've seen how none of the men ever return, and I'd like to not walk down that path. Also, the sun god, or excuse me, the Egyptian god Isis, again depicted with wings. And again, could these be a symbolic reference to having landing gear? When they would ascend or descend, you can clearly see that they would have the ability to use this landing gear as they're coming down or going up. So again, very interesting characteristics that are symbolic to what might have been visualizations of them seeing these gods ascending and descending in their various craft. Now, it's not just speculation that we see beings depicted with wings. Again, we have artifacts that we can scientifically analyze and say that, while this might have been depicted as a bird model, what we see looks more like an actual, model airplane. Characteristics more intrinsic to a modern-day aircraft. And this object was found in the tomb of I believe it was a governor in Saqqara, Egypt. And, again, when we study many of these various depictions, not just one sole object, but many of these that have similar characteristics to the power of flight, they're clearly not being depicted as flying animals and insects. They are the natives' culture at the ability at that time to depict what they saw. And so when we see references of a flying turtle or what appear to be flying insects, to me, it's very possible that these are actual representations of what they saw, craft being flown at that time. Now, there is a term, too, you can Google this, called cargo cult. And this is something that we've seen happen throughout the ages in even more recent times. Just like these artifacts are coming from thousands of years ago, what ancient man was probably seeing, we also have in more recent times the term cargo cult. And in World War I and World War II, when American soldiers first started to fly over Aboriginal locations in Australia and South America, and they never interacted with a white man or even seen technology, these soldiers land in their biplanes, set up camps, and, walk over to an Aboriginal and light up a cigarette and hold out our voice recorder and record their voice. The Aboriginals don't understand and think that all of this technology, these guys must be gods that have come down in their magical living craft. They don't even understand that the plane isn't alive. And so some interesting things happen is these soldiers have their encampment. They have shipments that are flown over and drop shipped into the soldier camp. Well, sometimes these shipments wouldn't land in the soldier camp. They'd land right in the middle of the tribe. And the tribe would be like, well, what is this? And they would rip it open, and they find canned food and weapons and guns and knives and tools. These are things from the gods. They didn't understand. So eventually the soldiers leave and fly away. And what do the Aboriginals do? They scrape away runways. Very similar to what we see in Nazca, even though we know those weren't necessarily runways, but they could have been things representing runways to lure back just like what the Aboriginals were doing. They would scrape away runways and they would make straw models just out of branches of these craft. Biplanes, prop planes, very similar to what we have today, an accurate representation based on just what they were visually seeing. So I think a lot of these items are exactly that, evidence of a cargo cult. They saw and were seeing things and did their best to carve them in wall reliefs and make intricate craft and artifacts to, resonate what they had held to be very sacred information or momentous events. So again, these depictions are again more intrinsic with an actual aircraft. They don't look like a wing of a bird. They look like the wing of a space shuttle or of a plane with a 90-degree tail fin and a rudder. These again look more like an ancient representation of a plane. Zecharia Sitchin found this while touring in a museum in Turkey, and I believe while they were looking through some artifacts that weren't on display. That's the other beauty of, let me just divert for a second. That's the beauty of a lot of our museums around the world, is they have a public display of artifacts, and they continually rotate what's in their collection to bring in, the locals and various people to see these exhibits that they rotate. But the key thing to understand is when you visit museums around the world, they have a vast collection of artifacts that aren't always on display. They rotate them. Some of the artifacts don't ever make it on display. So this was an item that Zecharia Sitchin found in a Turkish museum while reviewing some of the artifacts not currently on display, and they didn't know how to label it, because essentially you can see it's very rocket-like, and the curator didn't know how to explain it, so they just never really displayed it. Obviously, Zecharia Sitchin, his eyebrows kind of raised a little, and you can see in comparison to a modern-day spaceship or our space shuttle, here's the nose. Here's what appears to be the pilot with his knees bent. His head is missing, unfortunately. And again, it's a rocket. These are engines. What else could this be but a rocket ship? Unless it's some type of a land speeder, but no, it looks very clearly similar to a space shuttle. And Zecharia Sitchin, after further convincing the curator, said, listen, I understand that you don't want to label it, but why don't you at least put it on display as unknown, or we don't have a label for this. And eventually, through enough pressure, they did exhibit it a few times, referencing Zecharia Sitchin's work, probably to get more business. They should probably be doing that today. Now, other artifacts that I found in looking through various archives at the British Museum, the Louvre, there are depictions outside of what I am specifically looking for, which is Sumerian and various other Semitic languages and visual references of the winged beings. But what we also see are other references that come out of various other areas that have this similar reference of interacting with beings coming down from the heavens, or even some type of ascension process, which of course William Henry is a big fan of, the author William Henry. Some type of interaction with beings that had the power of flight or actually helped us return to the heavens. I'm not really sure what this is depicting, but I always found it interesting to look at these various references. And again, there are on display references from the museum that are translated by archaeologists and linguists, and really mainstream science, where they have problems with people like Zecharia Sitchin or fundamentalist Christians. I actually would guarantee you that if you asked anybody that has said Sitchin is discredited or Zecharia Sitchin has been disproved, why don't you ask that person if they also disprove the ancient astronaut theory? I bet you'll get a yes. Sitchin was one of the very few people that looked at the evidence from a ubiquitous standpoint, realizing that there's only a few hundred people in the world that can actually translate Sumerian cuneiform script. Again, it's the similarities of these beings coming down and having interaction with us. It's not just the Sumerian culture and the Anunnaki. We see these depictions coming from all cultures around the world. Now, again, some of the information gets a little bit more interesting when we look at some of the similarities with modern-day alien interactions and abduction scenarios. We've had these depictions that come out of ancient times, 7000 BC era, out of the Ubaid culture or Ubad culture. ancient Iraq have these depictions of what appear to be either reptilian or what I would consider to be android-like beings. Many of the depictions accompanied with these come with texts that talk about various beings that looked like this. There were actually certain questions that you would ask them to know whether it was alive or acting as if. Now, to me, that sounds like a robot or an android of some kind. But we also have to understand that these depictions of these helper beings to the Anunnaki, they're cited as flying their craft, helping in medical experiments. Well, that sounds very much like what we have with a lot of the modern day abduction scenarios. These watchers, these helpers, very well likely could be abducting people and taking genetic information, reproductive information, hybridization, and communicating or working with the overall creators here in this project, humanity, the Anunnaki. If they were able to genetically modify us, why wouldn't they be able to also genetically modify the Greys or have some interaction with a cloning race that they've used to help, essentially be intelligent androids? So these references to these ancient Sumerian versions of android beings or gray aliens, again, I think there's a similar overtone to what we're still experiencing today with these beings, that it's very possible that there's a large connection with what we have with modern day alien abductions, always having to do with reproduction and genetic material and hybridization. I mean, there have been people that have claimed to have been taken on board the craft after having, several abduction experiences and then being brought out a hybrid baby. And they clearly know that when the aliens bring this child to the mother or the father, they know that it's theirs. And the aliens don't let them keep them. So you can look into this information, the star children or these various abduction scenarios where hybrids are being created. But maybe this has been happening again for thousands of years if we realize that the Anunnaki originally created us with a genetic intervention. Why couldn't they have also intervened with other races and other species? So, these depictions of these greys or these ancient helpers are reported around the world, and we see them in various depictions, even going back to, the Stone Age and various Aboriginal cultures that, again, might have also been being abducted and had genetic experimentation being done on them, and recorded these visitations from these types of beings. Now, one thing that I've really started to find an interesting piece of information is the reference of these serpent gods. In South American cultures, as you'll see, we have various Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. They're always depicted as these serpent gods. And even in ancient Japan, various emperors and kings were depicted as lineage from actual dragons. So we have to wonder if these references to serpent gods, whether they are, for all intents and purposes, part of our ecosystem here on Earth, or possibly actual extraterrestrials visiting us, we have to understand that there is a long heritage of reptilian presence here on Earth. The dinosaurs were here for millions of years. What if the Anunnaki experimented on them? What if some genetic variation of dinosaurs was created and an intelligent reptilian upright reptile was created? Now, I say this in all sincerity, folks, because around the world, the mythical tales of these serpent gods is all throughout our culture. And he's even in our modern day, things like, the TV show V and various references to these reptilian aliens. So let's kind of explore that topic. Many of the South American cultures still have blood rituals and ceremonies without the actual sacrifice today that for thousands of years were used to appease the gods. There would be bloodletting, where they would capture a rival tribesman and slit their throat and capture all their blood in a big goblet and offer it to the deity or the gods, which were always serpent gods, reptilian gods. Some of the priests would actually even drink the blood, thinking that they were taking over the power of their rival tribesmen. Yeah. But we have to realize that these symbolic references are carried out even today in rituals played out in modern times. And these gods are always depicted with very colorful dress and have these reptilian overtones, some type of serpent god, if you will. And the various depictions of these gods have been memorialized in statues as well as monuments that, again, display a type of brilliance and an understanding to technology that we just can't really attribute to just ancient man. There had to have been some type of lost knowledge passed down to them, or direct intervention giving them the knowledge to do and create these amazing artifacts and edifices that we're about to look at. Now, as we've seen, the Mayans had a very accurate calendar system to predict when certain events were going to take place. Their prediction long count calendar said that in certain time frames, momentous events would also reoccur in the future, like their god Viracocha returning. Now, unfortunately, on the date predicted for Viracocha's return in the past, who shows up but the conquistadors? And while depicted very similar to Viracocha, there was a miscommunication where the Mayans opened up to the conquistadors, and essentially the conquistadors aggressively converted all the Mayans to Christianity and burned all their codices. Bummer. But what's interesting to note is what played out there was, if we realize that the conquistadors were misidentified gods. Why? South American people are all dark-skinned, dark hair. Their gods, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, are depicted as pale beings, red hair, white hair. This is how they thought their gods looked like. Not at all like their native dark-skinned, dark hair population. Very interesting. So a lot of the depictions of these current Inca and Mayan characters still have the symbolic references of the rituals that they played out while interacting with these serpent beings. And they've left us artifacts and edifices that today mimic various pieces of information that we still use today in symbolic references. While this is two serpents entwined, it's also a very similar reference to a DNA strand. In any medical institution today, you'll see the two entwined serpents, which again are a representation from thousands of years ago in understanding this is what our DNA strand looks like. Now, this serpent information is encoded all over South America in various structures, in walls, and even in large pyramidal form. This idea of a serpent or a dragon is, again, not only in South America, but around the world. We have these depictions of dragons coming out of ancient times. And if it wasn't just a mythical creature, that would be one thing. But emperors and kings discuss having this lineage. And so that you understand that this isn't just made up, think about the most biblical references we have. The serpent in the Garden of Eden. In the Gospel of Philip, Cain was actually brought to life by Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Various other Emperor Augustus, Alexander the Great, all claim to have this serpent lineage. So a lot of these references to dragons possibly actually interacting or mating with humans at some point, or having these hybridization projects between this species and humanity, is very interesting in realizing that these might have been actual creatures. Dragons might have actually walked the earth at one time. And why not? We had dinosaurs. There had to have been not just black and white, but scenarios of gray, where intelligent races of dragon, dinosaur-like beings were also interacting with humanity. Now, again, all through South America, we see these references of the serpent being clearly depicted in very great detail and in great lengths to communicate information. But what we also see is, even in modern times, we have these references of current UFO sightings that are showing us UFOs. And we have to wonder what exactly we're being shown. Most of this footage was captured by people that sent this to the local news agency, and Jaime Maussan in Mexico, who's like the infamous 60 Minutes reporter in the US, in the Mexico version, captured thousands of these what appear to be serpent-like UFOs. Now, some people would say that these are just balloons floating in the sky all connected together. And maybe that's so, but if you look at enough of this footage over and over, you'll see that there is no way that all of this footage is being faked. These are being reported currently, literally Serpant UFO sightings. So the last area I kind of want to talk about is looking at some of the most ancient records that we have coming out of the Mahabharata and these various Vedic texts in India, clear references for the power of flight and the ability for the gods to be using and harnessing flying craft. Here we go. You can see what, again, ancient man did their best to describe some type of craft piloted by people and bringing others with them in some type of chariot in the sky powered by what they could only depict as, geese or swans of some kind. But these references of not only a serpent god, but having magical powers and the power of flight is referenced over and over in various cultures. Again, you can see the similarity with these Hispanic cultures and going all the way from South Mexico all the way as deep into Peru, these references of a reptilian spirituality or some type of reference with reptilian gods comes from us in various cultures around the world. Now, the Indian gods are always most widely described as the most ancient gods that we have reference of on Earth. The Mahabharata is probably the most ancient written text that we've currently uncovered, at least in the public sector. But the ancient gods of India are always depicted with these amazing and beautiful colors. You have to wonder, and sacred shapes too. There's always just such a great detail of information being bequeathed to us in this artwork that we really have to wonder. You can see the atomic symbol here, like the atom. A lot of this information that comes out of the sacred Vedic texts and the Mahabharata and the Yuga cycle, that's another term, the cycle of the Yugas, which is something we're going to talk about as the lost cycle of time. Plato called it the Great Year. But boy, these ancient Indian texts have very interesting information that was bequeathed as sacred knowledge from the gods. And today we're learning it to be the new upcoming sciences that we're starting to crack. Now, a lot of the references that these ancient Indian gods had what we call vimana, and actual references of how these worked level by level, the passenger cabins, being able to actually see what possibly powered these craft and how they functioned. So very accurate information that has now been captured in monuments all over Asia as these vimana, or in some instances, we'll use the term stupa, as you'll see, where the Buddha would always be depicted in this very similar craft, what looks like a flying vimana, or some type of conveyance for the power of flight. Over and over, here's a reference of the stupa, which very much resembles the ancient Sumerian Shem, which, in no joke, you see depictions of what appears to be a rocket and the capsule departing that comes to Earth, the capsule that returns the astronauts. And this is the same depiction that we see over and over. I guess this is the end of the slide here. Over and over of these stupas, or again, references to some type of power of flight. So we really have to wonder if these aren't just symbolic references to mythology or actual pieces of archaeology in a time when man was seeing visitation from their gods. And hopefully within our future, in our lifetime, if possible, that barrier will be breached again and we'll have interaction with these ancient gods. All right, stay tuned for next week's lesson.